Welcome. I'm Ron Baker, Director of the Canadian Small Church Ministry Centre, sponsored by Small Church Connections here in Canada. And this is us, Canadian Small Churches in Action podcast. I am excited today to have with us a podcaster, she'll explain a little bit who she is, the founder of Small Church Ministry and the world's #1 resource for small churches. I'm excited to sit down and listen and hear. Actually, I'm already sitting. So let's just go from there and hear what we have to say. I'm going to let her introduce herself and a little bit of her own ministry journey, and then we'll roll with that. So
That sounds
take it away.
awesome. Thank you. Well, I'm so happy to be here. You can totally get me talking small churches any day.
Okay.
My name is Laurie Acker. I am the founder of the Small Church Ministry and Small Church Network, and I just love small churches. I started off in ministry more than 30 years ago in actually a really large church. And throughout the last 3 decades, I have come to appreciate and really love the more intimate ministry of smaller churches, which is relational. I believe it's deeply impactful. There's so many beautiful things about small church ministry. I think it's really under talked about, and I'm excited to watch the culture change.
I agree. In some ways it has become much more talked about, and perhaps
Yeah.
that's just that people in small churches are beginning to see that their relational effect is much is deep, impactful.
Yeah.
I think
Yep.
is what you would talk about. Now, there is a big difference between how a small church runs and a big church runs.
Hmm.
Can you contrast some of the leadership styles of maybe a small church and a large church? Uh, yeah, let's just throw that out first and take a look at it.
Yeah, I love talking about the differences between big church, small church, because it's one of the reasons we do what we do. And when people find us, it's like a breath of fresh air. Because for so long, small churches are used to trying all the things the big churches do and then feeling like failures when it doesn't work.
Yeah,
One of the things we say all the time is small church ministry isn't less, but it is very, very different. Now, when you talk leadership styles, I honestly think the same leadership styles are in big churches and small churches, but
yes,
what's
okay.
effective can be a little different, right? Because I actually started career ministry in a church of 3,000 people. So
Mhm.
I was hired as a junior high youth director, like full
Yeah.
time as a junior high youth director. And it was nothing to throw an event and get 50 people at it. And quite honestly, I think ministry at larger churches is easier in a lot of ways than small church. But one of the biggest things that I've noticed that's so different in small churches is small churches don't hire experts, but they have people with these huge hearts who want to serve,
Mhm.
but they don't always have the training or quite know how. And that sets us up with a lot of frustration because in a big church, you hire this expert, you hire a worship director, you hire your, connections pastor, you hire your youth director, and all these skills are coming in trained. Not always better, but it's very, very different when you're in a smaller church. But I honestly think the most effective leadership style is the same for big churches and little churches. It's a collaborative biblical leadership style where people have a voice and everyone is needed. And it's a bottom up type of leadership style where we're not just leading people, but we're doing ministry with
Yes.
people. So we're not doing ministry to people or for people, but we're doing ministry with people. And so effective leadership in small churches is always relational. It is always about developing and empowering people. And I would contrast that with recruiting. So many times people in small churches, how do we get more volunteers? You don't need to get more volunteers. You need to empower and develop the people you're with. And I just always go back to Jesus style ministry, right? Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly. If we're all doing that, we're going to be at a really different place.
We certainly have seen some leadership that has been more arrogant than anything else, and maybe
Hmm.
we talk a lot about, not a lot, we talk about scandals that have come, and yet I think I'm trying to remember the name. Says there's 5 different steps to your leadership, and the fifth one to make great leadership is humility,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
the ability, I think, to be relational.
Yeah.
Relationality That's such a great word. I don't
I
know.
like that. Is that a real word or did you make
I
that
think
up?
I may have just made
Relationality.
that up just now, but
I like it.
yeah, relationality. Can you describe a little bit of what that works out day by day? Let's take it's Monday and the pastor's supposed to be relational and the church is supposed to be relational. What is it that going to look like in a small church?
Wow. I love that question. I love that question. And just going back before I
Yeah.
jump into that, because I think it's all related. Church culture, when you mention arrogance and scandals, I think a lot of times our brains go to the big falls of arrogance and pride and all of that. But I think the church is full of that. I think small churches who don't have scandals are full of an edge of pride, and we become really performative, right? Like Sunday is a show, and I don't mean we think it's a show, but the amount of effort that goes into a Sunday morning
Mhm.
it is a production, right? And so when you talk about relationality, that's when we strip back all the production and it's more about who we are. And I think one of the biggest things that we're seeing a shift, little bits of shift in relational ministry is we're realizing that if we are not emotionally okay ourselves, any effort we have toward building relationships, it is performative. It's not doing what we want it to do because we can show up and say we care, but if we don't understand empathy or we don't have compassion for ourselves or our own stories, then our caring, like there's a wall up between our caring. Like we're saying we care, but it's almost like what you're giving yourself. If you don't give yourself compassion and love and grace and non-judgmentalist, you can't do it with other people. And I've learned so much more about that over the past just decade, even hearing more stories of not just church hurt, but becoming more aware of trauma, us, our growing up years, how other people have influenced us. Like we see this in our church culture today,
Mhm.
and our lack of not acknowledging we're building churches that have no culture of safety, I guess is kind of where I'm going with that. I
Okay.
recently interviewed Pete Singer on the Small Church Ministry podcast, and he works with Grace, Godly Response to Abuse in a Christian Environment. I believe that's what it's called.
Mhm.
But he talked a lot about factors that really make a safe place. And I don't think we can talk about being relational without understanding safety because there is a depth. Like we almost take off our humanity when we talk about ministry these days. We're going to do this, we're going to program this, this is how it works, this is the system, these are the 5 steps. And we forget that first and foremost, we're humans with mind and body and spirit and emotions. And I think we've got to acknowledge that if we're going to talk about relational ministry.
Okay, let's dig into that just a little bit because I'll call it the soul care movement that is happening.
Oh,
Uh,
interesting.
and
I
and
can go with that.
certainly trauma is highly involved with that. And in the last number of years, I sat in a small group where soul care became a theme of what was needed for that group because of trauma that was
Oh,
found there.
wow.
And so, who would you suggest would be some of the people to go to as a small church pastor or leader?
Mhm.
Where do I find resources that would deal with this whole area of soul care right now and current resources or previous? I mean, Henry Nouwen's always an interesting one to end
Yeah.
up with the wounded healer and a number of those type of things. But
Yeah, the first one that comes to mind for me is just Peter Scazzaro, all the emotionally healthy leadership stuff. But I hesitate saying that because I know many, many pastors and leadership teams who've gone through that as a system, as a group, and taught it, and they themselves are not emotionally healthy at all. And they still say, well, we've done that. Well, okay.
what did
If
you deal
you're
with?
exactly, but so we're so unaware. I believe we've been taught to be unaware. I know Canadians are a little different. I've got a lot of friends north of the border here in the U.S., but I think we still have kind of a self-made. We can do it. We can buck up in ministry. We're going to hold other people up. We're going to be overly responsible. Like I think most of us have that, and when we haven't dealt with our own stuff, and by the way, one of the best ways to know you haven't is when you have reactions that are like, wow, why am I so upset with that person? Like, even if you don't ever show those reactions, like when we're not okay, like we're okay. We walk into a situation, we're in a church meeting, we're giving a sermon, we're leading worship, we're teaching a Sunday school, and all of a sudden we've got like that little heartbeat that's like, oh, I'm not okay right now. I'm upset. I'm angry. I feel triggered. I feel agitated. That's that's an invitation from Jesus, as far as I know, to say, hey, what's going on here? What's going on here with me? So if you're leading and you're angry or you're bitter or you're sick of the people you're dealing with, or you feel very hurt, or you've got these things that pop up, like that's the sign, right? That we're not emotionally healthy. So when you talk about resources, yeah, that's great. Get Peter Scazzero, read Henry Nouwen, read books. But if we're not applying it and really looking at our lives, and I believe there's an overlap here for counseling and for understanding human psychology, just the understanding of what do we do with these feelings. Soul shepherding is another great resource, I would
Yeah.
say. I went through the Soul Shepherding Institute. Can't wait to go back. But I did their 4 institute retreats. I highly recommend those retreats. They're there's something different, and I've been in ministry more than 30 years, never experienced anything like it before, and highly recommend that.
All right. Well, relationality is on the one side. Um, how can a pastor know when they have achieved trust that is needed to effectively run a small church? I mean, if you're relational, trust is it. If the bank is
Yeah,
empty, people aren't going to follow. They aren't going to listen. There's nothing
yeah,
happening.
yeah, yeah. Well, when you say how would a pastor know they've achieved trust,
Huh.
it's what you just said. Is anybody following
Yeah.
me?
Okay.
Like are they following me?
Good point.
And again, I've been working through this lots in the last 10 years of ministry. Because when I started off in ministry at 22, it was like, let's get it done and let's do this thing and let's achieve and let's watch this happen. And then the further along you get in ministry, you're like, wait, something's missing here. It's really not about that. And it gets deeper. And I think I guess a couple signs that the trust isn't there is when you have to say, trust the leadership. Or when people come to you with an issue and you're not listening, but you're saying, hey, I totally get what you're talking about, but we know what we're doing. Trust the leadership. If you have to tell people to trust you, I think you're missing something, right? Like the proof really is in those relationships, that safe place, and the place where you really believe that the person talking to you has something to offer.
Mhm.
Like I think that edge of mutuality, not just collaboration, but mutuality, your voice matters. Whether you are a nominal person in our church who just comes now and then on Christmas and Easter, if we see the value in everyone around us, everyone that God happens to drop in the door, or we wonder if God dropped that person in the door, right? I think that's a factor of people trusting us. Like we've got to be human. We think people trust us by our competency, right? By what we do, by the way we lead, by the way we speak. But it is scientifically, psychologically proven and studied over the past many years that trust actually comes more. You build up trust when you are vulnerable, when you show yourself to be human. And I think we've got to get away from this confidence, show stopping, best preacher, best leader, and get in touch with our humanity, because I think that's the body of Christ. I think that's the whole story in Corinthians is the body of Christ. Get away from this completely hierarchical thing. And if there's trust there, you've got mutuality in your body.
Mm. Okay, let me ask you a question. Move to another part, which I find small churches have to deal with, and that is they can't do everything. Why would you form a network of small churches?
Why would I form a network of small
Yeah,
churches?
okay. Well, we'll start with that, and then why would a small church pastor want a network to be part of what they're doing? Why not just do their thing?
Oh, I would say, why would you not?
Okay.
Like we're called to, I don't know, just be together as a community to encourage one another, to build each other up. Like there are so many uniqueness in small churches. One thing I noticed when we started this ministry 4 years ago, I was just talking about creative ideas in small churches when we started. That was it. And one by one, I'm telling you, who found me and wrote an email? It was the pastor or the pastor's spouse saying, I can't believe you're saying a small church is okay. I've always felt like a failure. I've always felt like a failure. And so this is really a lot of what we see in the network that we have. It's we're building each other up for the sake of the body. Because when you're in a small church, it can feel isolating sometimes.
Yeah.
And so when we find people who get it, who know what we're going through, who have the same struggles, who have the same challenges, who have the same joys, the same frustrations, it's like you just found your soul sister and they could be 5 states or 2 countries away. And all of a sudden that spark comes up again that, wow, we are like, this is the encouragement of the body of Christ. So I would say, why would you not have a network?
Okay. Now, what about an in-person network, which is needed now? How does a small church pastor go about finding the people that would be a good part of a network?
Okay, that's a little tough. And
Yes.
the reason I would say it's tough is because how do I say this
You
politically
say it
correct or
nicely. You
without
can say it
stepping on
nicely or
too
not
many
nicely,
toes?
whatever.
Many, many people in small churches these days, or any church, are really jaded in different ways.
Mhm.
So we have found that trying to connect with small church people in your community can be amazing if you do it carefully, if you do it wisely, if you're not expecting a whole lot. But the reality is there's more. Okay, here we go. There
Okay.
are more unhealthy churches out there than healthy churches.
Hmm.
And so in your locality, right? You've
Hmm.
got to find that spark that's doing ministry healthy and loves ministry. Because what can happen when you connect with other people is we're all like, woe is me. We hate what we're doing. We're small. We're failing. That's where it can go bad, right? And so that's one thing we found in our network, the way that we talk, the way that we, champion small churches, there's got to be that cultural shift. So if you're in a healthy place and you can like do that spark in your city, awesome, be that champion. But if you are burnt out or you feel frustrated or you're not finding the solutions you want, that's probably not the time to start a network because in our current age, you will find more people in that spot. And the last thing we want to do is drag each other down. We want to pull each other up. We want to be those ceiling people, right? Who pull each other up, not the basement people.
So you bring up the question of, so how do we find the ceiling people so that we can move out of the basement?
Well, you're here.
Okay.
Right? I mean, you're here, I'm here. We're finding a movement kind of popping up.
Okay.
Honestly, I believe worldwide who are starting to champion small churches. And post COVID, we're finding that a lot of people really don't trust large churches anymore. They've left large churches, they've also left small churches, but
Hmm.
we're finding that spark of Jesus style community, I believe we're seeing it come up more in small churches. So I think the more that we connect together, spread the word, share our stuff, encourage that, we're going to find that happen more and more. In your city, when we talk about doing things community wide, share this podcast.
Hmm.
Like share the podcasts you see that are encouraging you, share it with other people, start the conversation, and then test it out before you jump into the deep water with someone. Truly, like we see it happen so much. It's not just in junior high where clicks go bad. We see it a lot, and so finding those people. But I do believe it's rare, Ron. I think it's rare.
You talked about Jesus style community. I love that phrase.
Mm-hmm.
That's but yes, I think it is rare, but I
Mm-hmm.
think a lot of people are looking for a Jesus
Agreed.
style community.
Mm-hmm.
And as you say, it's probably a movement. Well, I know it's a movement. And I mean, recently I attended an unconference about small churches or relational churches, and small churches, relational churches can end up being large churches, but you
Mm-hmm.
have to work things through and have to maintain that. So
Mm-hmm.
it's an unconference because we don't want to be programmed and conferenced anymore. We
Yeah.
want to be relational.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I think one of the tools we have right now between your podcast, my podcast, other resources, some of Carl Vader's stuff would be really great,
Yeah, Carl's
is
is good.
gather some small church people together around some of that encouraging content and have discussions about like this podcast. Like, what do you think? What's happening in your church? Is there really hope? Could God really be working in a small church? Whoa, like let's blow our minds here, right? And but to bringing content in like that instead of just, hey, let's network and talk about what's going well and mostly what's not going well, right? And so I think if we can have conversations around that, I think that would be a place to start for sure.
Is it just yeah, finding people and the resources? And I mean, you talk about being a large resource for small churches.
Mm-hmm.
What type of things have you provided? I mean, we've talked a little bit about some of the resources that you have available. Maybe you can just lay out a little bit more of maybe how you came to say this is a resource that small church pastors have, and then what you have.
Yeah, absolutely. So first off, my main audience is not pastors. Pastors come to me all the time and they're like, what do you have? What do you what I do, what we do
Mhm.
well, our superpower is encouraging and developing and empowering your volunteers.
Ah, okay.
So one of the things that I saw very quickly after being married to a pastor for 26 years in a small church was that that person can't do it alone. Like we have too many pastors out there literally trying to train all their volunteers, trying, and half of them are bivocational in small churches. Like,
Very much so, yeah.
so I'm just going to say it right now, you don't have to do it alone. Send me your volunteers, send me your ministry leaders, but get them on my podcast. Our audience, my audience is mostly women, not all women, but mostly women because I'm a woman. People resonate with me if they're a woman. Let me train them, okay? Because they're going to resonate with me more than they're going to resonate with Carl Vaders. If you don't know Carl Vaders, amazing pastor, champion of small churches. But the volunteers who are coming in,
Mhm.
by and large, by the way, the majority of volunteers in churches are women. And the only resources out there, other than mine, that are for small churches, by and large, are for pastors, right?
Oh
So
yeah.
we're pouring the few resources that are out there for small churches, we're pouring into one person when a small church has 70 other people or 30 other people or 50 other people or 100 other people. Send me them. Just send them my way. We have a free podcast. We have ideas on our website. We have a Facebook community that is super active, always positive. It's one of the most positive places on the internet. We also have leadership training for women's ministry, children's ministry, worship ministry, all specific to smaller churches. We have a leadership academy. So about I would say probably 90% of our resources are free. We also have to keep our business alive. And so we do have paid resources, which are amazing as
Mhm.
well. And we have quarterly conferences, which are free to attend live. And I'll tell you, Ron, if you want to help churches kind of like have like a little bit of a revival, we have a women's ministry conference at the end of January and a kids and youth ministry conference at the end of April. Small churches who have watch parties, they just have a
Mhm.
couple people come, maybe 3 volunteers, maybe 4 people in that area. They're literally connecting for free, online, virtual, but it's super relational with hundreds and really thousands of other people in small churches around the world and talk about a spark getting ignited. Like, it's like, we can do this. Like, we can do this because they're doing it. Small
Mhm.
church people, speaking to small church people, there's nothing like it.
One of the things that I found interesting after 20, 30 years having been a youth sponsor, someone
Yeah.
came to me from those first years and said, Ron, one of the things that you said was that you're always a leader no matter where you are.
Yeah.
And so I think, yeah, the volunteers, I think we do overlook that. We say, well, make sure the board of elders or the chair or the
Mhm.
pastor or whoever, make sure that they're up to date and the rest of us will just come along. But we're all
Mhm.
leaders wherever we
Yeah.
are.
Yeah. Well, and I think, and in all fairness, a small church pastor does not have time to do all that. A
No,
small church pastor,
even
tons
the
of
plumbing is a problem.
yeah, and let's say you're a former youth director, so you could totally train someone in youth ministry, but could you train them in worship ministry? I don't know. Most small church pastors do not have skill in every area of ministry. Like they don't. So that's even a self expectation that needs to go away. Like let's find somebody we trust who can train people in these areas. And small church specific, it's very different.
Mhm. Okay, let me ask an out of the blue question, and I may not expect an answer, but if you were to go back a number of years and say there were previous movements that pushed forward the small church, can you name any of those? And we're talking Western North American, because tends to be where most of for me where most of my background is.
Mhm.
But you can go overseas. You can okay. That's a weird question.
Well, it's kind of interesting because I know more movements that promoted the large church. Like I'm
Yeah,
trying to
that's
think
true.
if there were movements that promoted the small church. There have been movements like I mean, think of how many large churches are trying to get small with their home groups and their small groups. Like
Right.
that's probably, one of those edges where we see, that large churches really are struggling because
Hmm.
they see they're lacking the connection, right? But as far as movements that promoted small churches, I mean, we've got church planting, but half of the church planting mentality is we want to grow a large church. And I
Right.
would say, no, no, we want to meet the people that Jesus wants us to meet. Because if you think of Jesus's life, Jesus would have been considered a failure of a pastor if he was around today
Hmm.
in our church culture. We'd have these pastoral coaches trying to say, hey, Jesus, let me give you the 5 steps because this is what you're doing wrong. I mean, really, Jesus was, in our terms, he would have been considered a failed ministry leader. Nobody was with him at the end. He had 5,000 come on a hillside. Nobody came back to church. He had 12, he had 40, he had a scraggling of 70. And look at that. And I don't know, we measure ourselves, we judge ourselves and say, hey, we're failing because we're not growing in number. No, I would say, no, you're just like Jesus. Way to go. Let's keep doing ministry like Jesus.
Okay, exactly. I hate to say this, but our time's up. Again, I have a whole bunch more questions, but we're going to have to. I'll leave you with the one last question that I ask everyone that's on my podcast. If you had one piece of advice for a small church pastor or leader, and I'm going to say volunteer, what would that piece of advice be?
I would say embrace what's right in front of you. What if what you have right now is exactly what Jesus has for you? So, no, we don't know this for sure, but like, let's embrace this. There's a hypothesis, right? You get to either believe that Jesus gave you what you have or believe that you're cursed or something, right? Like that you're failing. If we believe that this is what Jesus has for us, our actions line up so differently, our momentum changes. If this is exactly what Jesus had for you, what would you do with it?
Mhm.
I think that would change our churches.
Okay, I don't usually do this, but I'm going to step one further step into the rabbit hole here
Okay.
and just say if that's true, why haven't we heard this before? Why aren't we hearing this? How can we hear this?
I think it's all over scripture. Like, I think we have heard it. I think we see it in the life of Jesus. He says, I'm going to do what my father has for me. Like, he did not spend 80% of his time putting together sermons and preaching. What we see of the life of Jesus is moving and walking and embracing who is in front of him. Zacchaeus, come out of that tree. The leper by the roadside, like where Jesus went, he embraced it. Like, we have seen it. It's just that it's not so measurable and it doesn't play to our pride, right?
Mhm.
And so we want something in a box. We want to say, if I do this, this will happen. That was not the way of Jesus.
All
Wow,
right.
you got me on a tangent now.
Yeah, we could go on, but we're going to finish off. So let me say thank you very much, Laura.
Thanks for having me. This has been a fun conversation. I hope we get to do it again
I
sometime.
do too. Thank you.